Thanks everyone for joining us today for this episode of our webcast series on best practices in digital risk management. Today's session is focused on sharing best practices in data breach response and compliance. According to several data breach tracking reports, the first half of 2017 saw a double-digit increase in breaches from the last half of 2016. In addition, there has been an increase of over 150% in stolen, lost, or compromised records. It becomes a particularly challenging operating environment for IT and executive management when you combine these statistics with the increasingly stringent and dynamic regulatory environment. With this webcast, we'll try to solve for some of these issues. Before we get started, I'm going to cover a few housekeeping rules. You've been placed in listen-only mode to prevent background noise from interfering with the presentation. We welcome your questions for the speakers, and to submit a question, please type it into the Q&A panel found on the Event Center console. If you have any issues with audio or video, please message the host privately or email us at info@digitalshadows.com. We've got two exceptional guest speakers today. The first is Michael Brumer. Mike is the VP of Consumer Protection at Experian. He has over 10 years executive leadership experience in information security with startups and large enterprises. In addition, he has over 15 years experience with Fortune-class companies like Dell and Pepsi. He's a sought-after thought leader for presentations at cybersecurity and InfoSec industry events like RSA. Joining Mike is Rick Holland. Rick is the CISO and Vice President of Strategy for Digital Shadows. He has more than 14 years experience working in information security. Prior to joining Digital Shadows, Rick was the Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research, providing strategic guidance on security architecture, operations, and data privacy. Rick also served as an intelligence analyst in the U.S. Army. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mike Brumer. Mike?
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate it. And you can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So one of the things that we have found in the breach response is for the last 12 months, we have actually seen a lot of anticipation both in the U.S. as well as in the EU for new regulation. And new regulation has always driven the breach response industry. It started really in 2003 in California with the first of the 48 current state notification laws that require companies that have a security incident that rises to the level of breaching individuals' personal identity information, you need to notify those consumers. More recently, the New York Financial Services legislation, which requires you to report into the State Attorney's General Office within 72 hours that you've had a notifiable breach. And then even regulation that has been updated most recently within states that either adds the types of qualifying personal identity information or changes the requirement to add a particular amount of identity protection. An example would that be in Connecticut, where if a Social Security number is compromised, you need to provide a couple years of identity protection or credit monitoring. So in anticipation of GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation that goes into effect in May of 2018, you'll be required in this case to report to the Data Protection Authority in one of the 28 member EU countries within 72 hours that, hey, we think we've had potentially a notifiable breach. We're doing forensics and we will advise you further if it rises to the level of a notifiable breach. It will have impact well beyond the EU, but the second phase of it also says that within a reasonable amount of time, just like in the United States, you're going to have to notify data subject if their privacy rights have been violated. And listed on the screen are a few other areas where the regulations, like in Canada with PIPEDA, in Australia, Singapore, and Brazil, there are new regulations that are very much either like GDPR and modeled after that, or just as stringent with regard to how consumers are notified, let alone the Data Protection Authority. One last point that I'll make about the global regulatory landscape is that in the United States, there's been lots of discussion, too, about a national law, and there have been many bills proposed in the House as well as in the Senate to create a framework that would supplant the current 48 states that have state notification laws. But we don't see that happening anytime soon, and it's simply because states' rights will always trump the federal government in this particular case. Jeff, you want to go on to the next slide? So one of the things that we have done for the past 4 years is produced a data breach response guide. And this is available. You can download it by going to www.experian.com/data breach. It's free. It essentially is your cookbook, not only how to develop a team and have a protocol to respond, but actually will walk you through the steps of preparing a response in advance, going through a tabletop exercise and practicing with your team, or being able to address any type of situation during a response, including any of the subcomponents, such as recommendations for PR, for forensics, for internal communications, delegated authority from the C-suite on how to respond. And so we offer this up. Again, we've done it for the last 4 years and continue to receive feedback from both individual clients as well as the cyber insurance and privacy attorney community. But it's a great resource that if you don't have a plan, you want to update your plan, you want a different perspective, it's very easy to follow and it's a free resource. Next slide, Jeff. I wanted to touch on some of the biggest mistakes that we're seeing, and unfortunately, these aren't new, and these have been common over the 15 or so years that we've been doing data breach response and the 22,500 responses we have been part of over those years. The first one is wrong team or commitment to the event. And this is about the preparation. If you don't have the right members, both internally and externally, on your response team, and a full-time commitment when there is an event for those people designated to be on that team, you end up failing. And we see this happening quite often where people either don't take it seriously, they're not allowed by their boss to commit fully to an event and have the time to devote to it, or they just aren't the right individual that has the responsibility and authority in that particular subject matter area to be able to respond quickly to events and make the right decision. The second one is the governance model, and I alluded to this about delegated authority, and you can really combine 2 or 3 is the governance model for a breach is that the team that's been selected to respond to the breach on behalf of the organization needs to have not only delegated authority from the C-suite to make decisions, but on individual decisions that may not be substantial, however important to keep the response moving and to meet important deadlines, whether they be notification to the AG, response to proofs on letters, setting up a script for the call center are a few examples. If you don't have a governance model along with the delegated authority from the C-suite, we see a lot of breach responses go sideways. Number 4 is poor forensics. Without knowing the answers to the 3 basic questions, how it happened, why it happened, and who's affected, you're not effectively able to notify consumers and let them know what's going on. And if you don't select the right forensics firm to be able to do this in a timely manner, we see breaches go sideways, even to the extent where the forensics firm, in worst case scenario, where a forensics firm say, yes, this information has been compromised, we're very confident, but not 100% sure. We launch the notification on behalf of the client and get that phone call from the CEO that says, hey, we've got great news, Mike. We found out that we really don't have to notify after all. Can you stop the letters? And the letters have already gone out the door. And last but not least, we usually partner with, since Experian doesn't provide legal advice under any circumstances, we partner with outside privacy counsel and recommend all our clients have that counsel on retainer that's an expert in responding to data breaches and privacy and security. If you don't select that right outside attorney, which becomes your breach coach and can be used to provide the attorney-client privilege or privilege for your response, that poorly selected breach coach can derail not only the organization of the response, but the actual meeting the deadlines, organizing the team, and making sure that everybody's doing what they're doing. So those would be the top 5 that we see across the number of breaches that we've worked over the past 15 years. Next slide, Jeff. The other thing that what we've seen particularly, and I allude to this, in the last 12 months, and we've been doing an average of about 4,000 breach responses on an annual basis. 10% have had an international component. More and more companies are realizing, especially with the advent of GDPR, let alone outside of the EU, that you need to have a truly global response ready to go given the circumstances. Not only because it's going to be required by law, and GDPR is one example, but breaches aren't limited just by geography, and it's not acceptable enough to just take the response you may have practiced as a U.S. company for the U.S. and apply it outside the United States, because such things like a multilingual call center or multilingual print capability, 24/7, live agents and non-translation, let alone understanding what the clear SLAs are with regard to not only the law, but also in coordination with multiple countries at a time. And then finally, it's taken Experian about a year to prepare just to get ready for GDPR and ensure that whether our responses from a notification call center or particularly identity protection for affected parties or data subjects in the event of the breach, that we comply with local law. So in thinking about your response team, make sure that you have spent the time to select the teammates, particularly outside partners, that have the capability not only to respond to an international incident, to be able to do it quickly, to do it on a large scale and over a large geography. Those are the things that I would point out, regardless of what type of vendor, whether it's forensics, whether it's PR, print, notification, outside privacy counsel. They need to have those capabilities demonstrated to be part of your team. Next slide. Final thoughts. These apply regardless of whether it's an international response or a domestic response. You need to have a written plan, and it needs to be updated every 6 months. Make sure your team is consistent. We know that members come and go in their responsibility, but it's really important as you develop a team, go through practice exercises in anticipation of a live event, that you maintain some tribal knowledge. You can't have all rookies on the football team that you're putting out to play. Practice regularly. We recommend a minimum of 2 times per year. The good companies will practice every quarter. And what I will say is that those that practice with really good live events and not just go through the motions are much better prepared. Pre-establish your relationships, not only with the AGs in the U.S., but particularly as each EU country has to develop and staff their own data protection authority in anticipation of the May 25th date for GDPR. Make sure you have pre-established relationships with the regulators. You understand when you're in the room with your other peer groups of outside vendors that are helping you respond. So this isn't the first time you're meeting them. That generally isn't a good sign. Number 5, the first 24 hours, if you haven't practiced and you aren't ready to go, you can actually torch your entire event if you don't do some of the right things. And we have a particular section in the data breach response guide that I alluded to earlier that talks about the 7 or 8 things you must do in the first 24 hours. The last 2, make sure you're transparent. Everybody needs to be upfront. The fact patterns may change rapidly. There may be new information or requests that come in, and you have to make sure that the entire team is operating under the same set of facts. I always recommend, if you have the opportunity to establish a live war room with calls a couple times a day where everybody has the same information to be able to make good, timely decisions. And last but not least, Murphy's Law comes into effect. Just when you think that everything's going smoothly, something else will come in. The most obvious one that we see quite often is preemption by the media, where a reporter will find out about the breach before you're ready to start your notification outside of the actual response team. There's also contingencies for law enforcement holds, as well as even as we expand geography and have these greater multinational or global type breaches, you're going to have more contingencies, and that works back to practicing regularly and updating your plan. So those would be my thoughts. Appreciate the opportunity to present here, and I'll turn it back to Jeff.
Great, thanks, Mike. That was great guidance on data breaches, and your experience certainly is invaluable. And we've got a few questions that are already coming in from the audience, but we'll get to those at the end of Rick's presentation. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Rick Holland of Digital Shadows. Rick?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. And Mike, thanks for queuing me up. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was how to be proactive and actually looking for where your data is exposed. And so I'm going to talk about a couple things with that in mind. One is where to look and what to look for. And then I'm going to move in and I'm going to actually go through a scenario that we'll walk through, which kind of lines up with the topic of kind of planning things out. And then finally, I'll wrap up with some suggestions on how you can do your own program to do these sorts of things. So areas that you'll want to look at, there's lots of places where you can find your data out there. Criminal marketplaces like Hansa, rest in peace Hansa or Alphabay, that have gone down, but there's others that have followed in their footsteps. Criminal forums where the actors are talking about targeting your data, stealing your data. Messaging platforms like Jabber, like Telegram, threat actors that are actually blogging and talking about their targeting. You'll see this with some of the extortion actors or hacktivists. And then finally, pay sites. Let's go to the next slide. So there's a lot of different things that you'll want to look for beyond just actually the data itself, because there can be things that can give you an indication of something that's coming, and perhaps you can stop the data from leaving your environment altogether. So one is just discussion of exploits, and I'm going to go into each of these in more detail. What insiders within your organization, what they may be talking about publicly or privately in a closed group, your data actually being sold, malware that's being sold that would be used to target you, people selling access to your actual infrastructure that could be used to then steal your data, and then adversaries that are talking about their attacks in general. Next slide, please. So the first one is just discussion of exploits itself. Maybe a good example of this would be monitoring a forum like exploit.in, which is a Russian language forum where there is lots of discussion of exploits. So you'll see people talking about, I'm targeting this sort of, let's say, widget, IoT widget that's out there, this point of sales terminal, which might be pretty germane right now given that it's Christmas time and we know that fraud increases at this time of year. So you can monitor for the types of exploits that are out there that line up with your environment that could be then used to steal your data. And this can also help you prioritize your patching. I used to run vulnerability management at a university, and I know it's a really big challenge. So making sure that we have an understanding of how exploits are being talked about and leveraged can be another point in the triage of what you do with your limited resources. Next slide, please. Insider threat. This is an interesting one, and here at Digital Shadows, we often will work with insider threat teams, typically in a financial services organization or in a retail organization. But insiders, there's a lot of different use cases that we'll see here. One might be someone recently found an example of a retail bank where someone was offering up access to high net worth individuals' accounts, and also how to bypass some of the PayPal controls to send the money out via PayPal. As one example. You might also see in the example here on this particular stock insiders where people are selling inside information that could be used for stock market manipulation. Something's going to happen, let's go ahead and buy now or sell now, that sort of thing. So people are definitely selling access to your consumers' information, selling access about company secrets, corporate secrets. Next slide, please. So then we also see straight up data being sold here, and we'll see this across the open, deep, and dark web. Oftentimes people will hyper-focus on the dark web. You'll often find things just on the regular deep web, and an example of this would be maybe a Russian language forum. It's a closed group, but it's on the regular internet. And they can operate on the regular internet in Russia many times if they don't target Russian citizens. So don't always think that all the data for sale is on the dark web. Certainly is a lot there, but you can find your data on the open, deep, and dark web. So being able to crawl those sorts of locations and interact is something that's important as well. Next slide, please. So then you can also monitor for your employees, your executives, and their data may be being traded online. We have a screenshot here. This is actually a carding forum, but they're also selling Social Security numbers. So if you're monitoring for high-value targets, you're monitoring for domains for your organization, you can pick up on data that's being sold there. Then you can actually start to try to understand who's the seller, try to understand how they got that data that was out there. It may also be rehashed data that's already been exposed for many, many years, which is really important when you don't have a lot of resources for doing the response activities that we're talking about. You don't want to spin things up in a manner that's not appropriate given something is years old. So that's important to understand to get that context around data that has been exposed. Next slide, please. So malware for sale. So here's a botnet as a service that's out there. So keeping track of, TrickBot is a good example specifically here on a type of malware. It's being used often targeting the financial services. But if you have an understanding of the types of malware that's being used to target a particular vertical or an industry and how those trends are progressing, you can then build up countermeasures to protect yourself. So this would be a good example similar to the exploit one from before, where if you're keeping track of the tools that the adversaries are using, you might be able to prevent data from being stolen in the first place, or make it much more difficult for the adversary to do that. Next slide, please. Another one that's been pretty popular, and we've done a fair amount of research on it ourselves, is people selling access to your environment. So again, this one might be an example where you might be able to get left of bang, be able to prevent something from becoming something much more painful. Here, and this is an example of one particular shop, people will go out and brute force your RDP services that are public facing. Will also buy access to credentials that have been exposed on the internet, and then run those credentials against RDP services, and essentially sell access to your environment, based on your domain. So someone might say, hey, we're going to sell access to Evil Corp's domain. So you pay to join these RDP shops, and then you pay for access to those RDP infrastructure in the environment so that you can conduct whatever your operation is. So something else you want to be monitoring for. Next slide. Actually, I would say if you have RDP services that are running publicly, that's probably the first thing you want to do, and not have RDP public facing, and make sure that it's behind a VPN or something along those lines. That would be my recommendation there. And then the next one is on attack planning. Now this would be more, I alluded to it before, specific to threat actors. Dark Overlord, maybe one example, who is talking about he has targeted he or she has targeted an organization, or in this specific example, it's hacktivists that say they're going to target an organization. And they may be sharing your infrastructure so that that can be targeted. But basically, threat actors that are talking publicly about who they're going to target. And oftentimes people say, oh, they're just hacktivists. Given the low barrier to entry for adversaries, oftentimes the low cost for them to conduct their activities, we don't want to forget about the hacktivists and just think, oh, they're just hacktivists. And we also have multiple tiers of hacktivists as well. Some that are the more script kiddie level, and then you have the much more sophisticated hacktivists out there, maybe Panama Papers, if you were to think that was a hacktivist group, but someone that is much more Finn Fisher-like, that has got more skills and capability. We don't want to minimize a hacktivist too much. Next slide, please. And then I want to give you a couple examples that are a little bit more specific, but come from some recent types of alerts that we've been helping our customers with. And one of them is GitHub. And one of the things that I often talk about is people not considering code sharing sites like GitHub as part of their shadow IT. It's very common that organizations will use GitHub themselves, and you won't know about it, and then there'll be something that they think is private, and then it's public. And then another flavor of this on the GitHub or on GitHub is where a third party is doing some kind of development for you and puts your code or references to your infrastructure in their code and puts it in a public repo. We've seen headlines with GitHub recently on these sorts of things, and we find a lot of pretty interesting in a bad way types of things here. One example would be SSH keys. We'll oftentimes find private SSH keys sitting out on GitHub. We'll find credentials to applications. If we go to the next slide, and we start to get into the Amazon world, and I'm sure a great number of you on the line today use Amazon as well. If you go to the next slide, one of the more painful types of things that you will find here, and I got this from some of Amazon's documentation, is access keys, access key ID and secret access keys that are publicly available unbeknownst to you that give you the keys to the kingdom. And I highlighted and called it out a little bit. Do not provide your access keys to a third party. By doing this, you might give someone full access to your account. So this is a really, really significant problem, is you don't know that's out there. They're able to do this, and now they can pivot around within your infrastructure in AWS, find all types of data that they can use. If you go to the next slide, it really kind of becomes choose your own adventure for the adversaries at that time. They could use that data for extortion purposes. They could use that data to resell elsewhere. If you go to the next slide, something that we're seeing as a result, well, it's been going on for a while, but it's only proliferating now with the cryptocurrencies and the price of Bitcoin. Now, I actually don't know what today's price is for Bitcoin, but that's what I put when I finished the slides last week. I'm sure it's gone up quite a bit. If you go to the next slide, one of the things that we're seeing now is that people are using your own Amazon AWS compute to mine their own cryptocurrencies. It could be Bitcoin, it could be other currencies as well. So, you often think, maybe you think, we don't have any data to be worried about. They're going to use their infrastructure to raise money for themselves, or is it to mine these coins so they can make money. So I wanted to point that one out because it's just an interesting trend, and it's pretty common right now given all the hype / hysteria around cryptocurrencies. Next slide. Another one on the Amazon front would be on Amazon S3 buckets, so the simple storage service, right? So this is where people are storing data, oftentimes sensitive, and they don't realize it. And you see this in the news. It seems like once a month at least, there's a very large organization We've seen some stuff with the Department of Defense. We found quite a few interesting things within our own customer base here where they don't realize that, and this is a configuration issue and kind of goes up with the handshake of Amazon, where you have to make this stuff publicly. Someone has made a configuration change to make this accessible, and so they don't understand the sensitive data is out there. And it's a really, really big challenge. So two pretty significant recommendations I would have for you today is, make sure you consider GitHub is an application that you need to be concerned about and tracking, and then make sure you get an understanding of where AWS is being used in your environment, and if you do use S3 buckets, to make sure they're properly configured and restricted. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to do, and this goes back to one of the things Mike said about having a plan and scenarios that you run through, I want to kind of walk you through an amalgamation of a current type of attack scenario that's relative to your data being exposed. So let's go to the next slide and we'll walk through this scenario. So for this scenario, we have a fake financial services company. I call it fictitious financial services. And what will happen is that attackers will get access to your environment, perhaps going to GitHub, to Amazon, perhaps going through a third party, whatever attack vector, right? It's really quite the menu that attackers have, that will use one of these anonymous email services to draft an email. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here we have a threat actor in the bottom left. Her name is the Dark Angry Unikitty. And if you're a fan of the Lego movie, you'll recognize Unikitty. But here she is sending the CEO of this fictitious financial services company an email, an extortion email. And if we'll go to the next slide, please. And here we have the CEO, which if you're fans of Mr. Robot, you will recognize the CEO of this fake company, and it's an extortion letter. Now, here the extortion is we've got 1.5 terabytes of your sensitive data, your toxic data, and we want you to pay us. Now, interesting, you talk about the currency value. In here, at this time, when I made this, this is actually all, I put this up on social media, this is actually a full-on identity. But when the Dark Angry Unikitty exploited this about 2 or 3 months ago, she wanted 60 Bitcoin, which was worth $250,000. Today, that's worth about 1.1 million. So a lot has increased in the value there. You probably see a threat actor using a lower amount that is probably under 500 grand, something that might be reasonable for a company to pay relative to some of their other expenses. So here we have 10 days to pay. Let's go to the next slide, please. So what the Dark Angry Unikitty, and again, you can follow her on Twitter to track her extortion activities, but what she does is she will go out and talk to the media. She will call out the company online, and this is something that the Dark Overlord, this is kind of built on Dark Overlord's MO, tweet these things out. Next slide. And now what has happened is the fake company has ignored her pleas, and they don't want to pay her. So if we go to the next slide, what the MO here is, then they start putting the data out there. So here she's got her own Pastebin page where she's loaded that out, and then they'll actually link out to a sample of the data on a mega upload site, so another cloud-based infrastructure storage site that's there. So this scenario is really from the headlines. We've seen it publicly with the Dark Overlord as well as HBO. We've seen it privately with the customers that we support. So what I would suggest to you as part of your breach response planning and your tabletop exercises is how are you going to respond when your CEO gets an extortion letter that's very similar to this? How are you going to interact with your public relations, all the different roles that Mike mentioned, outside counsel, outside privacy counsel, internal counsel, all the different roles here, and make sure that you have a plan for this, because more and more this is becoming the case. And it is, extortion has switched from I'm going to extort my grandmother's laptop to make money to now I'm going to extort a small medical company to now I'm going to extort your intellectual property if you're in the media and film industry, as you've seen attempts with HBO and some of the other movie and TV studios that are out there. And so we would expect this to continue. If you have something of value, you can expect the extortion attempts to continue and increase into other verticals as well. So I think you should really have that in your incident response program planning. So what I wanted to do now was give you a couple suggestions on how you could do some of these things on your own, and then I'll talk a little bit about our service. So if you go to the next slide. So one thing that you can do right off the bat, doesn't cost money, is Troy Hunt's site, Have I Been Pwned? He has an API that you can use. You can put in the domains, email addresses of your company, and you can find out if they're out there. Now, you'll see a lot of stuff from 2012 with LinkedIn and MySpace. They're out there, but you can at least then go in and check in against your users and see the last time passwords have been changed. It's probably likely for a lot of these breaches that passwords have been changed, but at least it'll give you an idea. So this is something you could do 5 minutes after you finish this yourself at a low cost to you. Next slide, please. So what you can do beyond that, and of course this starts to, there's a friend of mine, she works at Rapid7, she's got a phrase, as free as in puppies. And this would be an example of this, but this is still something that you can do. Scrapey is an open source crawler that you can use to go out and crawl the open web, the deep web. You can build macros into it to have you log into login portals and things like that. But this would be build your own Google bot, right, where you're going out and you're looking for things related to your brand, things related to your key employees, executives, high-value targets, things like that. You're going out and collecting against and finding these sorts of data in a more proactive manner. Next slide, please. You can also build your own human capability. You can't automate all the things that are out there. Crawlers can't touch everything. You have to get by CAPTCHAs. There are some ways to from a technology perspective to bypass that, but you do need vouching. You may have to pay for access through other goods and services or through a cryptocurrency. So you could develop your own stable of personas and legends to do this. This takes a lot of effort, a lot of work to do. You definitely want to check with your legal team and get their perspective on it. But because you can't automate all the things, this is something that you would want to do or would want to consider very thoughtfully. But it may not be the best thing for you to do yourself. It might be better to outsource that. Let's go to the next slide. So what we do and how we could help you do the things that we've talked about on this side is, Digital Shadows helps people monitor for risks beyond your boundary. And we don't, in my new role as CISO, I have limited resources, limited budget, and I want to invest and maximize my investment. So instead of buying something that only hyper-focuses on one thing, I want to be able to maximize my investment and have a very strong capability. And that's what Digital Shadows does. We're not just focused on social media. We're not just focused on dark web. We have very strong focus on those areas, but we're much more inclusive, and we give customers context across all of it. So here we have cyber threat, which is a threat intelligence capability at Digital Shadows. We're monitoring for brand exposure and risk related to a brand. We're looking at physical threats. We're looking at exposed infrastructure and the digital footprint there. We're looking at exposure around VIPs, executives, high-value targets. We're looking into supply chain and looking at third-party risks there. And of course, what we've been focused on here is we're looking at data exposure. And of course, all the use cases that we've talked about today are things that we can help you with. Next slide, please. And what makes our service unique is we start and it's tailored around you. Unlike a lot of providers out there where you get this information back and you're not sure how relevant it is to you, we start with you on the left and we start with your assets. And you could use this list of the types of things they tie back to things I've already talked about today, or if you were going to try to build your own, you could use this to kind of help you on things that you need to consider. But your domains, your IPs, document markings, project names, your supply chain, package names, code names, those will start to get into some of the things that you might find on GitHub. Looking at mobile applications, looking at all the different brands that you might have, looking into your social media. So this is where we start. And then we go out and collect against it, and that's where we have the sources on the right. And there's three broad ways that we do our collection. One is, we have our own crawler. I recommended Scrapey to you as one alternative crawler, but we have our own crawler that's out there. We also plug into APIs, so APIs, social media APIs, things like that. And then we also have human collectors because you can't collect everything in an automated fashion. We try to do as much as you can that way. And then we go out and target all these sources. And then ultimately what we're doing is we're finding these digital risks to your organization, We do it through a combination of things. If you go to the next slide. Digital Shadows is a service. So we're not a tool. We can be used as a tool, but we're not a tool, we're a service. And what I mean by that is we work with our customers on the planning and collection phase there, right? So we build up that asset list, and then we go out and do that collection on their behalf. That collection, again, humans, APIs, as well as the automated component. And then we have automated analytics in the mix. So here we have machine learning models, we have rules-based processing that are kind of sifting down and filtering out the types of events that we see. And then importantly, a human analyst comes into the mix, and not for everything, but for a lot of it, is going in and validating and giving additional context. So this is where, when I say we're a service and not a tool, we have a team of human analysts. We have over 20 native or fluent languages that we cover. We go from California to Europe as far as where our analysts are located. And ultimately, between that combination of automated analytics and the human context, we produce and disseminate out to you. In this example, we took 500,000 raw mentions and produced 68 alerts to our customers. And so it's tailored, it's relevant, and then we have lots of ways customers can consume our alerts through our APIs. We launched a partner ecosystem in September, and we had 12 initial vendors in that to really help people automate the response to these types of alerts that we're putting out there. Next slide, please. And so if you're interested in getting a free look at what your digital footprint looks like, we can do this for you. We can run a free trial for you, give you an idea of what these external digital risks are, and give you a flavor. One thing that I've been recommending is part of my role in CISO, is using a service like ours to understand what you look like on the outside that you can use to help justify budget for 2018. Maybe there are some things that you're interested in. This could help you understand the value that a service like this could provide to you. And with that, let me turn it back over to Jeff for Q&A.
Great, thanks, Rick. The first question that came in is, out of all the breaches that you've seen, what percentage of companies survive? And Mike, do you want to take that one to begin with?
Well, actually, there's a lot more that survive than don't. There was a statistic floating around the web, which we found out was actually false, that we used for a while, and that said that about 60% of all small businesses, so this would be under 100 employees, that have a data breach go out of existence within 18 months. That number, I think, is exaggerated. However, I will point out that if you just look at the headlines, especially since the Target breach of 2013, and you fast forward now to this year and look at some of the high-profile breaches where the board, the CEO, the Chief Information Security Officer, the CFO have all been terminated over a breach event. And it's not because they handled it well, it's because the thing went sideways. And in many cases, the terminations or the loss of revenue, and again, we've seen in some cases about 60% of the cost of a data breach to a company is the loss in brand reputation or stock price. Many of these are avoidable mistakes that could have been solved by a good plan. But it's true there have been a few companies that have gone out of business, but there are a lot more that might take the hit for the short term, but do survive, after a stock drop. And that's kind of the general rule we've seen.
Thanks, Mike. Rick, what are your thoughts on that question?
I think it gets a lot of headlines as far as companies that are going to go under. I think if you look, 12 to 18 months out, the implications may not be as bad as they were at the time. What I'm curious about is come May in a post-GDPR or a GDPR enforcement world with some of the fines there. I think you could expect to see some sacrificial lambs, and probably starting in much larger organizations and maybe mid-size. But just like when HIPAA originally came out, HIPAA High Tech came out subsequently, and then there was fines put on top of that. I think GDPR could be quite the game changer, and most companies are international companies, or many of them are, and we work with a lot of U.S. companies that are very, very concerned about GDPR as well. So I think it could be a painful game changer come June of next year, May, within June when fines come out.
Great, thanks, Rick. I think this question is tailored to you, Rick. When you find data for one of your customers, I mean, what recommendations do you have from the get-go on how to address the issue?
There's a couple different things that we do. We look at metadata around things that we find to try to get characteristics around it to try to give more context there. If it's being sold in a marketplace or a forum or talked about in a forum, we try to understand the threat actor who's involved and their story. Do they have a good reputation? Have they sold a lot of things in the past? And just try to understand that actor themselves. Depending on where the data is located, you might be able to do a takedown for it. Now, if it's a dark website, that's unlikely. If it's an open web or even a deep web type of site, you might be able to, and we have a takedown service, we can help our customers with that particular takedown to try to get that content down. Now, if it's on something like GitHub or if it's on something like Pastebin, that is a much easier way to do a takedown. So really, I would summarize it by, trying to give context, as much context we can around the data type itself. Have we seen it anywhere else? Context around the threat actor that's talking about it or selling it, and then try to help the customer. Once it's out there on the internet, it can be obviously quite difficult. The internet is forever, but work with the customer to try to use the takedowns to the extent that we can to get the content pulled offline.
Thanks, Rick. The next question is there a source or location to be able to identify which regulations are applying to my business? Do you want to start with that one, Mike?
I'm sorry, Jeff, could you repeat it?
Yeah, sure. What they're asking about is, is there a good source to track or monitor all the regulations in terms of data privacy that apply to their industry or their business?
There are a couple good sources. If you go to any one of the major law firms, they will have a site that talks about the state and federal notification laws here in the U.S. And the best source that I've seen for international regulations in terms of global security and privacy is infologgroup.com. I believe that's the correct one, or it's World, and I'll check it right now, World Law Group, but they will also have information about, there are approximately 36 countries now that have, and this was before GDPR went into effect, but including those countries in the EU that have a regulation that pertains to privacy and security. So I would suggest any one of those. Again, there's Norton Rose Fulbright, there's Baker Hostetler, Mullen Coughlin are a couple examples where you could go to their site and they would have information about the current laws both domestically and then this World Law Group. And let me just double check it while I'm on the line for international notification, and let me come back to you.
Okay, great. Rick, while we're waiting on Mike to get verification of that, another question came in, and that is, what types of content are you seeing most frequently breached? And I don't know if you have a prioritization of that or if you see trends in that, Rick?
Yeah, credentials is pretty common today. However, I think one point there is a lot of times that those credentials are rehashed. credentials. So that's definitely high on the list. We see lots of payment card details as well. So not so much on the data exposure, but payment information that's there as well. And then a lot of access to environments. RDP is one example that I mentioned before as well. But it definitely will depend on the geography that someone's operating out of, threat actors that are targeting it, and you'll see different things in the verticals. I mean, a big trend, and I alluded to it a fair amount, was health information with some of the extortionists that are out there, Dark Overlord being one example. And then it seems like a more recent trend over the past 6 months or so has been intellectual property for media and film, similar to the HBO type of example.
Yeah, Jeff, the correct site for the Global Data Breach Guide is www.theworldlawgroup.com, and it has a free download for a guide. Also, Georgetown Law, their tech review has an update on current laws. So those would be a couple that I'd mention.
Great, thanks, Mike, and thanks, Rick. And Mike, we did have a question come in while you were checking on that, and that is, what types of data do you see most currently in terms of data breaches? So do you have any visibility into what you see most targeted?
What we're seeing is very large databases being amassed together. So you'll have a group that's targeted, and again, what we've seen, and again, these are from the forensics experts that we work with. We saw, and I'll use a real live example, you had in the recent Yahoo breaches, usernames and password compromises. Then they'll go into a database that might compromise social security numbers, passports. Then the third one goes after vectors of addresses, banking information, and what the underground networks that Rick alluded to, depending on the space that you're buying and selling the data, they'll have complete strings of someone's identity that they've purchased or stolen from different sites. So you see a very targeted response from these hackers if they're looking for data that will round out what is a complete, what they call a fulls or complete identity string for an individual, so that they can go ahead and sell that, because you have that complete data on an individual. Then you can go into banking accounts, you can open new accounts, you can create lines of credit, you can get a passport, and then it becomes a real problem in full identity theft.
Great, thanks, Mike. Rick, we had a couple people ask about the tailored view of their digital risks and what they need to do to get started on that.
Yeah, if you just follow up with the information there that we have, info@digitalshadows.com, we can get you set up with a trial to take a look at your digital footprint and help you understand those risks that are out there.
Great, thanks, Rick. Had a few more questions come in. I know there was a question, Mike, about the breach guide. And so they weren't able to locate it, the data breach response guide on Experian. They weren't able to reach that. So after the event, I'm sure we can access that and send it over to them.
Sure, I'm actually on the site right now. So it's www.experian.com/data breach. It's where all of our white papers and guides are. It's on there. I'm looking at it right now. But I will send and make sure that you have the right link on that. There's also a new forecast. We just put out a forecast that was released last week in the media of it's the third annual that we've done on security and privacy predictions for 2018. That's also on the site as well, but I'll send that over.
Great, thank you. Well, Mike, any closing comments on your end?
The one thing that's come up, Jeff, and I just caution everybody now, we're already starting to see the W-2 scams and IRS tax fraud occurring, and tax season doesn't hit till January. I think it's going to be really brutal this next few months. So if you have anything to do with your W-2s, get any requests from your boss to say, hey, I need you to send W-2s, if you have that responsibility, be careful because the scams are very prevalent. We're working about 5 or 6 per week already.
Great, thanks for that insight. Rick, what about you?
It's interesting. We were just having a conversation on the exact same topic with our research team this morning. So, yeah, I would echo that piece. I think what I would say to wrap up at a more macro level is, you know, in my role here as CISO, I want to have a full understanding of the risks that are out there so I can make the right investment with my very limited resources, just like everyone else out there. So having an understanding of what these external digital risks look like really help inform my risk posture and how I might place my very limited pieces on the board. So, you know, use Digital Shadows, a service like ours, to help you identify these risks so you can have a more informed decision as you try to execute your programs.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Rick. Both great presentations, highly informative and incredibly valuable. And thanks, everybody, for attending today. Watch your inbox for an invite to the next webcast on best practices in digital risk management. Thank you.